was 8 years old, I had a rather unsettling experience with 2 adults in my apartment complex. Sounds silly maybe, but it definitely wasn't. This was during the days of selling Cease candy bars for my school's fundraiser. Normally, my mom would take me around the neighborhoods, just a little further from town, and we'd hit several houses of what would end up being some pretty generous people. One week, she couldn't do that with me due to working late, so I ended up making the rounds in our apartment complex with a friend from class who also lived there, Alex. Alex and I split up, and I was working the ground level of an apartment building while he worked the ground level of another across the way. I had probably done 3 doors, no answer, before I reached the door of an older woman. Younger than my grandma, but older than my mom, best way I can describe her. She had this sort of dirty bleached hair, almost orange but darker at the scalp. She looked and smelled like a smoker, which I recognized from my own grandma. The woman asks me what I'm selling, so I tell her chocolate candy bars. I go into my whole spiel. As I'm finishing, someone else joins behind her in the doorway. He's an older man. I could swear that I'd seen him before, but I couldn't immediately place him. He was big and bald. I guess he looked kind of generic, but he was enthusiastic about the chocolate bars, telling the woman with orange hair that they gotta get some, lots of them. He wants to know how much for the whole box. I was amazed. No one had ever asked that before. Maybe 10 at the most, which I remembered was $25, but I had double that in the box, maybe more. As I worked out the math in my head, they asked if I would have change for 100. Feeling like my lucky day, I told them I sure did. That's when they opened the door a bit more, showing me the inside of their smoky and, in my mind, messy apartment. The woman walked in a way that she was now behind the man. He was looking down at me for a moment before he said, "Okay, kiddo, you come on in, we'll get you that money, you get us some change and some chocolate. Sound good?" I almost just walked right in, but I hesitated for a moment, and that's when the woman said she couldn't wait to try the candy bars. She grabbed something from her pocket. It was $5. She asked if she could just have one while we figured out the cost of the box, and then quickly followed it up with asking if I liked dogs. I did like dogs. She then said I could definitely meet their new dog if I just came inside. I was starting to feel overwhelmed by her questions, so I started by setting my things down to grab the chocolate bar. When I looked up, they were no longer right in the doorway. They'd moved back a bit, now standing inside their apartment, but the woman held out the $5 for me to take. As I reached for the money, she held onto my wrist instead of taking the candy bar. I sort of panicked and asked why she was doing that. Instead of answering me, she just used her other arm to grab me, pulled me close to her, but facing away from her and covering my mouth with her other hand. This had never happened to me, obviously, and before she even put her hand over my mouth, I hadn't thought to scream. Now, I was screaming. Muffled, but I was trying. That's when the man came out, grabs my backpack, takes it inside the apartment and out of view. I'm still squirming, trying to scream, but she's not letting up. So I start kicking backwards, making contact with her shins. She almost lets me go, but instead reaffirms her grip, now trying to pull me further into the apartment. I'm assuming the worst. These people are gonna kill me. That's when I doubled down, alternating between becoming dead weight to try to escape the grip that she had, but also one arm partially free. I use that elbow to drive it into her side as much as I can. I keep one foot rooted on the ground, driving the other as hard as I can backwards, kicking shin, ankle, stomping her foot. Finally, one blow causes her to release her grip. I drop down slightly, and the moment I hit the ground, I start to run. I also start to scream again. She's literally chasing me for a moment. But I hear the guy scream at her to forget about it. I hear something get thrown, but I don't dare turn back. I just run to the building where my friend was. He's still on the bottom floor, talking to someone, as I'm running at him like a wild man. I guess maybe I was crying by then because the woman talking to us had ran to grab tissues and her house phone. Eventually, I calmed down enough to tell them both what's happened, and the woman's already on the phone with the police. My friend runs home to get his mom. By that time, the police are there, so I tell everyone the story at the same time. It was when I pointed to the apartment. My friend reminds me and tells the police the woman living in that apartment has orange hair. The man was large and bald, and he worked as a maintenance man in the apartments. That's where I knew him from. I ended up getting my backpack back, my candy too. The money was full-blown missing. I assumed that's what they took from it, and threw the rest once they had what they needed. Well, they got arrested. Me, my friend, and my friend's mom all watched it happen from their apartment window. My mom, naturally, was pissed. She was calling the couple all sorts of names, telling the police they better keep those pedos locked up. I didn't even know what that meant at the time. I wasn't allowed to do those door-to-door things anymore. In fact, I don't think they do them anymore at all. This was over 14 years ago, so I have no idea. But in my opinion, that shit's super not safe. But on a positive note, I did end up getting the money back. I never had to see that maintenance man ever again, or that woman. Pretty sure he got his ass fired and evicted. Hope it was worth the $186 they had to give back. Creeps. So here's a fascinating and horrifying story about my stepmom, Olga. When she was a young child, she was plagued with health issues. They prevented her from leaving the bed most of the days because she was too ill to stand for long periods of time. The sickness came on suddenly when she was in the middle of first grade. One day, Olga is an athletic, happy girl. The next morning, she's throwing up blood in her bed, running a fever of over 39 degrees Celsius. And all of this was happening at the worst stretch of time in her adolescence so far. Her parents were in the middle of a separation. When Olga saw her dad, it was either him sleeping on the couch or screaming and fighting in the kitchen with her mother, Ava. Then he'd be gone again for weeks at a time. At the young age of 24, Ava had taken on the responsibilities of a single mother, tending to a sick daughter alone. When Olga first went to the hospital, the doctors would originally diagnose her with acute ulcers due to the issues at home. They'd prescribe her a heartburn medication that never really fixed the problem. Olga said the intensity of her fevers would make her hallucinate to the point of seeing people walk around her room. She'd be sitting up in bed wide awake, watching as the shadow in the darkest corner of her room bends and morphs into a human silhouette. Then that silhouette stepped out through its two-dimensional boundaries, becoming a three-dimensional being. Then they'd usually walk through the wall adjacent to Olga, passing by the foot of her bed. Olga tries to tell her mom about these vivid shadow people that she's been seeing appear in her room. But Ava's answer is to start diagnosing Olga herself with allergies and illnesses that she's read about in books and checked out at the library. By this point, Olga had stopped seeing her physician. None of the doctors that met with Olga could figure out what was wrong with her. A few times during this, Olga would have a break in her fever. She'd even have enough strength to get out of bed and walk around the house. Then after dinner or the next morning, her fever would spike again. She'd be forced to take refuge in her bed for weeks. Olga's dad was a lawyer. Every couple of years, he'd uproot and move the family on a whim, taking a high-profile client and needing to be closer to them, or partnering up with a law firm until the relationship goes sour. Olga's never in one place too long growing up. The family had only recently moved into that house a month before Olga's dad had left. This place was a stark contrast to the other homes they'd lived in, though, located in a small town near Salem. Within the first week, Ava would begin expressing concerns that she thought she was being stalked by someone. Olga's dad ignored her claims, accusing her of lying to get attention. One particularly scary incident involved Ava running through their front door. Her face was bruised and she had a rope tangled around her neck. She was in hysterics as she told Olga and her dad about going to the market and getting attacked by two men. They came up from behind and grabbed Ava in the parking lot when she was putting away her groceries. They tried to pull her into their car, but she was able to cause enough of a scene and fight them off long enough for them to give up and run away. Ava didn't get a good description of them because they attacked her from behind. After a moment of silence, Olga remembers her dad scoffed and asked her mom if she'd gotten the 2% milk. He belittled her claims and insinuated that she'd done it to herself for attention. The ordeal had left Ava in a state of despair, while her partner continued his daily routines, emotionless to the family. Olga said that she'd never seen her father smile. He never laughed, never played or showed affection. Her scrapes and bruises weren't met with empathy. She was told that crying made her look weak. Eventually, Olga stopped crying, stopped trying to be heard because she knew no one was listening. Olga had been treated like a miniature adult and expected to act accordingly. That's why Olga chose not to talk to her mom about the waking nightmares she'd been experiencing on an almost nightly basis by that time. The entities appearing in her room began to speak. Most of it was in a garbled English, though some were in a different language. But all of them sounded like someone talking under the water while you're just above the surface. Random words could be understood, but most of the noise was too muddled for interpretation. None of these matte black figures that would cross through Olga's bedroom were the same. All of them different sizes and shapes, each with different speaking tones, and none of them would interact with Olga as they passed by the foot of her bed, except for one. A stout female entity with long hair flowing like smoke from a candle, but its direction going down instead of up. She stands at the end of Olga's bed. Her face is featureless, but Olga can feel that they're staring into each other's eyes. Olga can't believe what she's seeing, and she really has a moment to examine this shadow figure. Besides the hair becoming more translucent as it's parted and moved by her shoulders, the rest of her was pure, deep black. The light given off by Olga's side table lamp was absorbed by its skin instead of reflected. Then it spoke to Olga. The sound was so close, she didn't know if it was in her head or if it had been audible on the outside. Though a submerged tone, Olga believed it said, "You feed the flowers." To stop herself from screaming, Olga kept her hands cupped tightly around her mouth. She did that the whole time this entity was interacting with her, all the way until it stepped back from her bed and back through the wall. For days, Olga would think about those words, what they could have meant. Then, one sunny afternoon, the mailman brings a vase filled with beautiful daffodils. It was addressed to Olga. Her first grade class had gotten her a bouquet of flowers, along with a get well soon card signed by all of her classmates. Ava brought it into Olga's room, put it on the table beside her. When she left, Olga laughed at herself when a tear escaped from her eye. More tears would follow as she smelled the sweet fragrance of her flowers and read through all the little notes her friends had wrote on the edges of her card. Later that night, Ava prepares Olga's dinner, places it on a TV tray in front of her. Olga often struggled to keep food down, so her eating habits mostly consisted of picking through little bites of food, taking small sips of water, rarely able to finish what was on her plate. Her mom would make her finish the glass of water, though. Ava insisted it be gone by the time she came to retrieve the dishes. This night was like the rest. Olga would choke down a portion of her meal and then decided she was done. Olga set the TV tray on the floor next to her bed. But before she got fully back under her blankets, she saw her glass of water sitting on the tray that she barely drank. Olga was already feeling a bit nauseous, didn't want to place any more substances in her body. Instead, Olga grabs the glass. She dumps it into the egg-shaped vase of flowers from her class, and then goes to bed. The next morning, when Olga wakes up, she finds her flowers have wilted and died. Almost instantly, this makes her recall the shadow woman, what she'd said. Seeing the flowers are now dead, it scares Olga enough to make her stop drinking the water her mom would bring with every meal. She became so dehydrated, she had to crawl from her bed to the bathroom in her room just to get a drink from the faucet while her mom was asleep. When her mom would bring her the water, she would later pour it off the opposite side of her bed, next to the wall. It would eventually start to mold the carpet and smell, but not before Olga had already been doing this for over a week. In this time, Olga found that she was less fatigued and tired. She would keep her slight health improvement a secret from Ava, using her new sense of energy to quietly explore the house when her mom would go to sleep. Olga was also having to deal with an increase in appetite, so she would sneak into the kitchen, eat the leftovers that were thrown away that night. On one of these excursions to the kitchen, Olga notices a small box on the counter. It was tipped over and some of its contents had spilled out in front of it. Its mess frozen on display and left to clean up in the morning. Olga walks over to see what had spilled. At first, she's inspecting the small mound of thick white powder, thinking it's baking soda. She puts her finger in it. The texture is softer than baking soda, possibly flour or powdered sugar. Olga also remembers finding a small amount of this substance on the rim of a water glass that her mom had brought to her. Ava told Olga that it was powdered dish soap from the dishwasher. Olga, being a child and curious to find an answer to her new little mystery, was about to put her finger in her mouth to taste it when her eyes just so happened to glance over at an eye-catching red and white logo on the box. Below the name was an image of a white rat, over it a red X. Olga knew that anything with a big red X should probably be avoided, so she quickly wiped the powder off of her fingers onto her pajamas. Olga initially got scared, thought that she'd put her hand in rat poison, but she'd never seen a rat in the house, and the box said tracking powder. Olga left it as it was, ate her snack, and went to bed. The next day, while her mom was at the store, Olga calls the only number she can remember, which is her Uncle Victor. He's surprised to hear her voice, and he listens to her tell him about the water. When she's finished, Victor tells Olga he's on his way over. Olga sits on the living room couch, watches out the window for Victor. He lives in an apartment complex 2 neighborhoods down. But before she sees his truck, Olga sees Ava's car turn into the driveway. Olga leaps from the couch. She's about to turn and run to her bedroom when she sees Victor's truck come flying in, pulling directly behind Ava's car. Ava gets out of her car, startled as Victor jumps from his truck and starts yelling at her in Russian. Ava starts yelling back. This is the angriest Olga has ever seen Victor. He was frothing at the mouth while he was yelling. Then, Victor pushes Ava to the gravel, starts walking towards the front door. He sees Olga in the window and tells her to unlock the door. She's petrified with fear but runs to unlock the deadbolt. Victor kicks open the door and yells at Olga to get in the truck. He then walks back into the bedroom, opens her closet door, and with one bear hug grasp, manages to get all of Olga's clothes in between his interlocking arms. Then he turns, pushes Olga in front of him. He's guiding her with his hips down a path towards his truck. When they got into the driveway, Ava started screaming at Olga not to get into Victor's truck, and that she'd call the police. Victor tells Olga to keep walking, starts cussing at Ava in Russian and English, calling her insane, saying that he'd be calling the cops when he and Olga got back to his apartment. Victor threw Olga's clothes in the bed of his truck, then lifted Olga with one arm, opening the passenger door with the other, throwing her in. Victor slams her door, then walks around to his side and they kick up gravel, leaving marks on the driveway as they back out of it and onto the road. The short ride to Victor's home is silent. When they get to his apartment, they leave Olga's clothes in the truck, walk right inside. Victor gets on the phone with the police. Olga sits in the living room and listens to him tell the police that his sister's been poisoning his niece. Victor tells the cops that his sister has always had problems, but she never got help. He never thought that she'd do something like this. As Victor sat on the couch next to Olga, she saw him cry. Then Olga cried. Eva had been lacing Olga's water with rat poison and other drugs to keep her sick. After Olga's dad left, Eva's abandonment crisis and other underlying mental health warnings manifested into an unhealthy obsession to feel needed. Olga's sickness gave her the purpose she was so desperate for. It was the assurance she needed that Olga could never leave her. My stepmom ended up living with her uncle Victor until she met my sad, divorced single dad at a baseball game in their early 20s. She fell in love with his wackiness and the little nugget he had with him. And we've been a happy family ever since. Needless to say, I've never met Grandma Eva.